Morning, welcome to East Street in Kent. It is June the 10th and on a lovely sunny morning here in the southeast, here's my first update of my new garden. I'm going to take you on a similar route to what I did last October. The prairie garden's establishing nicely. A lot of annuals last year, a little bit more perennial growing going on this year. Some reseeding I've been doing with some of the annuals. There's annual salvia, but the perennial down the front is calamint and nepeta. I've got a couple of nice thymes just getting established. The grasses are starting. This is Calamagrostis acutiflora Carl Förster. There's some big teasels down below, and the planting, a few new bits of perennial planting. Monarda didyma, courtesy of rosiebees.com, that I can recommend. The Stachys humalo just getting established, and this border on the right here, there is a Geum down at the front. That's Geum rivali Leonard's variety. There are Hemeropolis and Allium spherosophanum just coming through, Naughty and Macedonica, and as last year Sanguisorbia. Got Verbena bonariensis. As you can see, this is a little bit what they call the June gap here in the UK. So we've gone through the early spring flowers. All the foxgloves are halfway through. There's a Cornus cusa over there in full flower, and Veronicastrum, Hempagramini, and the Rudbeckia, all yet to flower. So prairie gardens are in the UK dominantly a sort of later summer flowering part of the garden. I'll just take you through. This is the shady border. The pulmonaries have got more established, the log pile. I've got a trap camera which I like to place behind that hedgerow. It's surprising how much activity there is behind. And this is all a lot more lush than when I last filmed in October. The two main borders. This left-hand bed we're sort of concentrating on the blues and purples, and the one to the right is going to be the hotter colours. That's Gaillardia Arizona Sun, which is in flower at the front. And just behind me was a sort of raised paving stone rockery, which we've opened up. We've removed a couple of shrubs at the front and replanting with foxgloves and shuttlecock ferns, primarily the primroses, and a big good display of foxgloves this year. Tucked into the back of here there's an active white-tailed bumblebee nest. There's one just going in, but I don't think, actually no, that was a bee feeding on the white dead nettle. There's an old mole run, and they seem to have established themselves in there. Composting area, slightly more aesthetically pleasing than it was last year. I think I'm going to get some willow hurdles and place those at the front. And similarly in the back, there was one of the forest garden beds with red currants and glove artichokes. There's fennel and French beans just to sort of put something on the ground. Discovery apple is coming into fruit. Very pleased with how the hedgerow, these whips went into the ground in February 2021, so they've only been in the ground 16 months. Some of the planting, a lot of weeds in here. Now a lot of people, even with a wild hedge, will give advice to keep the ground clear to allow the plants to get established, but I think the soil is pretty good here, so the hedgerow shrubs are doing perfectly fine. I'm a moth trapper, so I'm quite keen for there to be plenty of variety in the garden. Being a wildlife gardener, I know we have to tread carefully between the lines of a little bit of untidiness and the more aesthetically pleasing aspects of the garden. But if you can let a few weeds, and there is bindweed and there's a bit of bramble in here, which I will have to manage. But I suspect that once the hedge gets established, that will block out the light and a lot of the weeds will then die out. The ground cover plant here is sweet violet. That's just getting established. and the meadow is sort of up to knee high. There's a big campaign in the UK called No May, and a few people have tagged it on to Let It Bloom June. And the issues that we're having over here is that a lot of people are doing No May, but having created that habitat, if you then mow it all down straight away, you've removed the home for all those insects. And it's great that you've, especially if you've got flowers, you will have helped the local pollinators. But things like grasshoppers and beetles, and there's a lot of young frogs in here as well. So you do have to be careful when you're. But to be fair, it does get hard, and if you've got a small garden, you've only got a fly mow. It is very hard to take this down. I'm not sure if I mentioned on the last video that I did a scything course last year, so this is about 40 foot square of meadow, with quite a few mown paths through the middle, and I did that all with a scythe, which at the age of 59, that's the hardest workout I've had for a while. This is an old cherry plum tree, which we know was the only tree which survived the '87 hurricane, previous owners, and as you can see, that is split, but I've got a video of it during Storm Franklin, and it wasn't moving that much. But deadwood is very important to the wider environment, so I hope to be able to leave as much of this as I can. I have taken some of the deadwood just to take some of the weight out of the top of the tree, but essentially I certainly want to leave the framework, and should keep the local woodpeckers happy. Reporting back on the meadow planting, so a lot of advice about not trying to plant into existing grass meadows. It is more difficult. The wildflower seed sowing, which I did after a hard cut and a hard scarify, at this stage doesn't appear to have been that successful. I used 4 ounces of yellow rattle. I imagine that's probably 200-300 seeds, and there are only 6 in flower. There's one just down there, and for those of you who don't know, that is a hemiparasite, and it actually feeds off the roots of the grasses, so it gradually weakens the sward and hopefully allows more flowers in. I've plug planted with common knapweed. They won't flower until probably July or August, and will stand, and those will be fed on by goldfinches, and there's probably about 20 in here. So there's certain aspects of the areas of the meadow that I'll be leaving standing, and but as a wildlife gardener, you're leaving a meadow much later. If you are cutting hay for fodder, then you would be cutting it much earlier, in sort of the middle of July, when the grass still retains all its nutrition. But and the other thing I'll be doing, this part of the garden was left completely, so this wasn't cut last year, and it's sort of dominated by some sort of stronger grasses, Yorkshire fog and possibly cocksfoot and a few of the other vigorous grasses. So this one will be getting a cut this summer, late this summer. And just in case that cherry plum does fall down, just dotted around, there's 4 or 5 young whips, so even if it was to fall down a particular direction, most of them will survive, and hopefully will go on to replace the tree behind me. You can see that the grass has grown up around the trees, and the comfrey is just due for a sort of a quick cut, and then I'll just leave it on the ground to feed the tree, as I mentioned before. This is a clump of ragwort, which causes a lot of consternation in the wider ecological community, and that last year had, not that particular clump actually, one further back, had cinnabar moth caterpillars, and I think 2 weeks ago to the moth trap, it was my first ever cinnabar moth that I've seen, which is a gorgeous red and black number. And then through down into the main, or the formal garden, there's a border I showed you last year that we've extended, and that this year's just been sown with cornflowers. Now these are all sown at the same time. You can just see how these ones are 2 feet tall, and just to the right of the bed, which is underneath that big holly, it's much drier, and the cornflowers are much smaller accordingly. And I've just infilled with some scabious. And lastly, the pond. We've added on the bed. The lowest part of the pond is just in the sort of top right corner. I'm quite pleased to say I'm getting quite a few, open up, small tortoiseshell butterflies this year, which we didn't get last year. That is ragged robin, a native British wetland wildflower, which does very well here. And the pond, much more growing. What I haven't lost yet is, at this stage, a minor design flaw. But so the ridges that I put into the pond, some of you will have seen Joel Ashton's work, which I much admire. All power to his elbow. But the sort of sump part of the pond that he then builds a large retaining wall, and obviously that's an added cost, all of that stone. So I have built the ridges and I've cambered them back so it will hold the subsoil in place. But at this stage, that white forget-me-not, lovely flower, hasn't quite spread out to the front, and whereas the brookline over there is sort of suddenly filled a third of the pond, whereas this brookline plant down here is looking very weedy, and from the nighttime cameras we know that's because the local fox treads there when he's having a drink, and so does every wood pigeon in the area. It's quite a small pond, we even had herring gulls in having a drink. And then this end, some more boggy area, I think by next year that will have probably filled up with water mint. So all in all, very pleased, and it has been attracting hedgehogs. There are dragonfly larvae in there already. This was filled on July the 11th last year, so that's how quickly you can go from a bare pond to something a little bit more wildlife friendly. The vegetable garden's coming along nicely. A little bit more infrastructure in place this year. I've grown more veg for customers than I have for myself in the past, so just the added expense of buying hoops and netting, which if I was on an allotment I'd be building out hose pipes and things, but because this is right outside the kitchen, it needs to be a little bit more pleasant. And broad beans, it's been very windy. We've had a very windy spring here, or a very windy winter, and the broad beans have been getting a bit of a battering. And lastly, I think this was all here last year, I'm growing potatoes in sacks this year. A front veg garden, that's all runner beans, climbing beans and peas. I'm not sure if I showed you this last year, and that's a rain garden tank, so it's connected, you can't quite see, it's connected to the downflow here, and it floods out, and then there's an overflow pipe. Thank you, Andy, when you get to watch this video. That was an old washing up trough from a school art room that he was clearing out, and he kindly donated to me. Anyway, and we're just replacing this fence, which is going to let some sun through into the veg garden. And thank you for listening, and speak to you soon.